Hello, and welcome back to the Botstiber Podcast. Today we are joined by Megan Brandow-Faller, Professor of History, Philosophy, and Political Science at the City University of New York, Kingsborough. Much of today's conversation centers around her upcoming book, Child Creativity in the Visual Arts, From Secessionist Vienna to Postwar America. Topics include Franz Cižek's philosophies on child creativity, the contributions of Emmy Zweybrück and Viktor Lowenfeld, and the meanings of their teachings in the digital age, with much more. Enjoy! Megan, it's so great to have you here for an episode of the Botstiber Podcast. I've really enjoyed the little snippets of your upcoming book I've been able to read so far. And to start, I was hoping that you could kind of introduce yourself and give us a little bit of a background on your research interests and kind of the work that you've been doing, and then where the idea for this book came about.
Sure, and thank you so much for the invitation today. So this current book project is called Child Creativity in the Visual Arts, From Secessionist Vienna to Postwar America. And it's a project that I'm really genuinely excited about because it has so many facets to it. So in a nutshell, it traces the idea of the dissemination of progressive ideas of teaching children art from members of the Vienna Secession and Klimt group, famously the famous discoverer of children's art, Franz Cižek, to post-war America, and how these ideas of children's imagination, children's expressivity, the idea that children are fonts of original spontaneity, how these ideas really became entirely mainstream in the broad American public. As for the genesis of this project, this is a project that has been rooted in my other books. It is sort of an accident. It's sort of funny. My academic persona is as a prolific mother, as a prolific writer. I do have children myself. But this topic of women's special interest in teaching art and women as artistic toy makers is a topic that found me by accident, in fact, because I wrote my dissertation on women's art education in late Imperial and First Republic Austria. And it just so happened that many of these women artists specialized in artistic toy making, largely because that was something that they were slotted into, and it was perceived as a gender appropriate form of creativity, although they did very subversive things with it, in fact. So this book is something that's grown out of my previous books, and in The Female Secession, my book on the women artists in the circle of the Klimt group and Wiener Werkstätte, there were several women who emigrated to post-war America, one of these being the very fascinating Emmy Zweybrück. And her story was a story that deserved to be told.
Could you kind of explain, I guess to start, for people that aren't aware, what the secessionist period of Austria was and kind of what was happening in these time periods that allowed Franz Cižek to kind of become the creator of these ideas of child creativity and its importance, and then how figures like Emmy Zweybrück become a major part of that story?
Sure, absolutely. So, in this time period, around the turn of the 20th century, there was a general rebellion against historicism, against historical models for artistic creativity, and a widespread search for new forms of artistic influence that were supposedly untainted by past modes of expression. And one form of expression that was famously discovered was the art of untutored children. Now, this leads us to one of the central figures in my book. There are three case studies: Franz Cižek, Emmy Zweybrück, and Viktor Lowenfeld. And the central sort of father of children's artistic development and creativity is Vienna Secessionist and Klimt group member Franz Cižek. So he was a budding academy student who was originally from Bohemia, but came to Vienna to study at the Academy of Fine Arts. And quickly he realized that children, in fact, had more to teach him than his academy professors. He rented rooms as a boarder, not far from the academy, and became fascinated by the children of his landlord, who gathered around him and scribbled on a bench that was in his studio. And he was fascinated by this children's artwork and eventually decided that he wanted to dedicate his career to furthering children's artistic development. Notice I did not say teaching. We'll talk about what this meant, but famously, his mode of teaching was non-prescriptive and allowing children to draw from their imagination. So, in essence, he launched private art classes for children in 1897. And then a few years later, 1903, 1904, these classes became attached to the Progressive School of Applied Arts, the Kunstgewerbeschule, which of course was a hub for Viennese modernism in general. What was revolutionary about Cižek? Now, of course, art had been taught before in the context of schools and other institutions, but art was mostly taught for vocational purposes to teach competence in industry, or that young people should be skilled in mechanical drawing so that they might be competent in industry, or that they were taught to copy ornamental forms. Cižek's classes were different because there was sort of he viewed children as a blank slate. And famously, he allowed them to draw from their imaginations. He did not correct their drawings. He did not measure children's art by adult standards of realism and refused to intervene in their creative process. Rather, he gave them free rein to different media and materials, allowing them to and encouraging them to bring forth the emotions, feelings, expressions that were within them.
So when I was first reading about this, and I definitely don't come from an art history background or educational development background, so you can help me kind of piece it together if I'm misinterpreting, but there was this realization of the impacts that creative self-expression could have for children in their own development. And then you also mentioned how child art itself influenced some artists of the period. And I'm kind of confused on how child art influences modern, I guess, vocational art or the art of professional artists.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to cover here. There's so much to this story. So one thing that I covered in some of my previous publications, such as the Female Secession, is the influence of children's art on professional adult artists. This is a separate story that's sort of been told a little bit before, at least by myself and a few others. So around the turn of the century, Franz Cižek and others famously discovered untutored children's drawings and prized these drawings precisely for their spontaneous nature, for their expressivity, for the fact that they were seen as pure and uninfluenced. Now, we'll talk about this. It's this idea of the children's art being uninfluenced. It's a little bit more complicated than that. The enthusiasm of Cižek was famously shared by his colleagues in the Secession, the members of the Klimt group, like Otto Wagner, Josef Hofmann, Gustav Klimt, looked through folders of children's drawings and made jokes that were, in fact, quite serious, like, "Gentlemen, let's give up painting. The children do it better." And they were the ones that encouraged Cižek to launch these classes. Now, you asked about the influence of children's art on professional adult artists. Definitely, children's art was a potent source of artistic influence for early Viennese Expressionism, and professional adult artists and designers, especially art students, discovered the aesthetics of children's drawings, this, raw, untutored aesthetic, which led them to their own expressionist idiom. My colleague Alana Shapira has published on this with regard to students at the School of Applied Art, as well as my own work. And it was an especially subversive sort of influence for women artists, given that there was this, in Secessionist Vienna, perverse sexual fascination with the child woman. So for women who were themselves thought to represent a sort of domestic primitive, discovered by secessionist educators precisely because they were untainted, unspoiled in a similar way as children, right? For these young female art students to deliberately work in a childlike idiom was pretty radical, I would say, that was sort of flaunting their outsider status in the face of, their teachers. So in a nutshell, you can say that children's art was discovered and was an important source of artistic influence for movements like Expressionism in the applied arts, as well as Cubism, other movements as well. I hope I answered that well, but it was certainly a very potent form of influence for the experimental work in the interwar Wiener Werkstätte or Vienna workshops.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very interesting concept or idea. And when I was studying in Berlin, I had a music history professor that was adamant artists who make music of a certain genre in kind of in honor or as a result down the line of someone who created that genre, the art itself isn't as pure because it's taken from an existing creative genre. And I feel like that kind of overlaps with the idea that the children in these untutored lessons would be expressing themselves and creating art from a more untainted, untouched place.
Right.
And with that being the case, how did they perceive, like, why was it negative for them to be introduced to other artistic narratives or guidelines or ideas, and what was the benefit of keeping it separate?
Yeah, these are great questions and questions that are so relevant today, for educators, parents, even in light of the digital realm, which we can speak about later. So Cižek was adamant that children, he saw himself as a sort of gardener, right? He did not teach or impart knowledge in the traditional sense. Rather, he wanted to allow children to grow and to develop what was already within themselves. And that being said, he disdained the baneful influence of books, museums, posters, periodicals, because all of these outside external sources were sort of hampering this sort of garden of children's creativity. They were being, exposed to forms of artistic expression that were foreign to them. So it was precisely for this reason that he preferred children of poorer families, working class families, rural peasants, because he believed that they were the most isolated, the most uninfluenced. Now, ironically, it wasn't a secret that a large number of well-heeled, secessionist patrons sent their children to these art classes as well. So there's a major debate on the nature of Cižek's children's art that attracted the attention of leading pedagogues at the time. For instance, the student of John Dewey. So John Dewey was also aware of Cižek's classes. He visited them at least on one occasion, and his student Monroe famously criticized the children's art of Cižek's classes as being, in fact, not as uninfluenced as Cižek maintained, but very influenced. It's a difficult problem, but many commentators said that the work of Cižek's students was in fact not uninfluenced, but remarkably sophisticated, remarkably precocious, and tended to look like the adult art that was on view in the museums, the exhibition venues, the Secession itself. So we have this remarkable phenomenon whereby the children were supposed to be uninfluenced, but perhaps they were learning from the aesthetics of the adult art on view around them, even as the adult artists were perhaps trying to unlearn from the children themselves as well. But if we do look at the work of Cižek's students over time, we do see that some of the earlier works, around the turn of the century, tended to adhere to this secessionist folk art inflected aesthetic. And as time went on, they produced works that were also expressionist, cubist, futurist as time went on. I hope I've expressed that okay.
Yeah, I think that was great. How did Cižek's ideas then begin to migrate or emigrate, I guess you could say, to the United States? And then a second part to that, in the United States, where there's such a focus on standardized education, how does this concept of art education without an abundance of outside influence on the child themselves exist within a standardized education system?
These are such great questions. So much to think about. So let's talk about the migration of Cižek's ideas to the United States. And that's really where this book begins because, the influence of Cižekian children's art on professional adult artists is something, that I've covered before. So first of all, I would say that there is a fascinating story of interwar, especially Vienna, being a mecca for progressive art educators, particularly from the United States and Great Britain. So, art teachers, critics, artists flocked to Cižek's classes and watched them, observed them, sort of like people made pilgrimages to Montessori in Italy. And if you read the guest books of Cižek's classes, they are full of prominent names, prominent artists, prominent critics. I mentioned Dewey was there once, but also, commonplace everyday educators who often came in groups and packs from different private schools and public schools. So the current book really focuses on the transmission of these ideas from secessionist Vienna to post-war America. There's a lot to be said, and in the book, I focus on a couple of primary mechanisms by which these ideas were spread. One critical thing that spread the ideas was a landmark American tour of Cižek students' works. So there was a major exhibition of Cižekian children's art that opened at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in December 1923 and toured the United States for about 5 years, making a huge tour, finally going to the West Coast and ending up in 1928. The exhibition was something that attracted the attention of leading museum professionals. The director of the Brooklyn Museum, in fact, played a leading role in curating it. And it toured to major venues, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Brooklyn Museum, the Chicago Art Institute, the Milwaukee Institute of Art. It's a huge list, but there were also a number of smaller venues as well. And this exhibition and the print campaign surrounding it brought widespread attention to Cižek's methods and ideas, which were already known in the United States through the efforts of progressive educators. Now, I should mention, the economic situation in post-war Austria, not a surprise to listeners, I'm sure. Abject poverty, starvation. The proceeds from the exhibition and the sale of print materials relating to the exhibition, that is to say postcards, posters, lithographs, were used to provide relief for the classes to continue their existence. So the Cižek exhibition was one major way which his ideas were spread and awareness was raised of his ideas. It was common that entire school classes visited the show and then often brought their parents on the weekends. Ironically, Cižek never published the major theoretical work to English-speaking audiences that he wanted to. And another thing that I look at in great depth in the chapter on Cižek is his never realized book manuscript that was intended to be the definitive work on children's art, progressive art education for American audiences. There was a great demand for it. We see it in the guest books. Educators are asking, when will the book be released? I'm leaving my address, send me the information. So some people who might be vaguely familiar with Cižek and his reforms are not familiar with the notion that he was actually under contract with Yale University Press for a major theoretical work on children's art that was never realized due to a number of complicated economic factors. He instead had to rely on his ideas being disseminated by his followers, for instance, Wilhelm Viola, and also by the other two case studies in the book, Emmy Zweybrück and Viktor Lowenfeld, who in many ways define their own philosophies in opposition to Cižek. So I can say more about any of those things, but I want to let you take the conversation as you like.
Yeah, no, I think that was great. And I wanted to move on now to start to better understand who Emmy Zweybrück was, how she factors into the story, and then we can follow it kind of like the book does and move on to Viktor Lowenfeld next, and how their philosophies differed from Franz Cižek and how they were also similar and helped spread the message.
Sure. So Emmy Zweybrück is the second of the book's case studies. She was an artist, a pedagogue, an art educator who specifically focused on educating young girls. And I would also say that she is definitely one of the most successful Austrian-American emigre artists in general. She received a retrospective exhibition at the Vienna Secession shortly before her death. It was curated by her close friend Josef Hofmann in 1955. So she was very much a very successful figure. So she is different because she takes Cižek's ideas. She very much used her connection to Cižek. Sometimes in some sources you will see her portrayed as a student of Cižek, which is actually not true. But she used the connection to these familiar landmarks, these familiar touchstones of Viennese modernism, Cižek, Hofmann, others, to market and sell herself in interwar Vienna and then post-war America. So she took Cižek's ideas in a more popular direction and, in fact, in a more commercial direction. She has a remarkably successful career. She opens her own private art school in Vienna, teaching girls that operated on principles similar to Cižek, and also had an attached commercial workshops attached to the school, the workshops Emmy Zweybrück, similar to the Wiener Werkstätte, but with an emphasis on historically feminine media and materials, textiles, embroidery, also toy making and book illustration. But she's very different because whereas Cižek's influence in America would be mediated only indirectly through the exhibition and through the writings of his followers, she had an immediate impact because she began touring the United States and teaching summer courses to art educators and was sought after by leading colleges, universities. I could give you a big laundry list to educate art teachers on how to teach children arts and craft effectively. Now, she also opened her own classroom, her own institute to visitors in Vienna. So she really established her own reputation as a progressive art educator linked to the methods of Cižek in the 1930s. And because of her partially Jewish background, decides to emigrate permanently after the Anschluss. She becomes artistic director of the American Crayon Company, which was, really the second largest crayon company at the time, and has a tremendous influence in bringing Cižek's ideas into the mainstream, bringing these ideas of children's creativity, creative expression, releasing what is within yourself, and using that to market art products, commercial slogans, and really pushing her agenda of modernist art and design. We can talk more about this later, but she was really a critical go-between figure between the Vienna Secession and figures in mid-century American modernism. For instance, she was a very close friend and professional acquaintance of Ray and Charles Eames. There is a fascinating series of correspondences contained in the Library of Congress that I looked at between them, and was very exciting about bringing the ideas of mid-century American modernism to Viennese audiences as well. Now, there were some major differences between Zweybrück's philosophies and those of Cižek. And one of those being that, as I mentioned before, Zweybrück had this strong connection to historically feminine media and materials. But one difference was she really did not shy away from teaching solid handcraft knowledge in a way that Cižek did not.
So before we move on to Viktor Lowenfeld, a few more questions about Emmy Zweybrück now. You mentioned the many different classes that she set up, some very much in her own design, and some of them were a more collaborative approach. But could you describe kind of what these classes would look like, what students would be doing, and how they might differ from the typical modern American perception of an art class?
Sure. I mean, for Zweybrück or all of the educators?
For Zweybrück.
Yeah. So one thing I'd like to clarify with regard to the legacy of Cižek and Zweybrück. So one thing that was revolutionary about Cižek's classes, which carries through into all three art educators, was the idea that educating children to think and create was not something that was to be used for vocational purposes. Paraphrasing Cižek's followers, he wanted to educate children broadly to be useful in the 1,000 workshops in the world. So again, the expectation was not that he was training professional artists. He wanted simply for creativity and artistic practice, artistic expression, to make them better human beings. And that was something that carried through into all three art educators in different ways. Um, with regard to Zweybrück, one thing that is fascinating about her is that although she was a highly trained professional woman artist and industrial designer, she collaborated successfully with a number of famous manufacturers. She was not shy from also teaching female amateurs. So, one thing I talk about in the book at length is the notion of Emmy Zweybrück sort of being a sort of Martha Stewart figure of this World War II era. She marketed crafts kits, not only for children, but adult female amateurs, which were a major sort of response to the way that this do it yourself craft culture proliferated in the garages and attics of post war American ranch homes and was really carving out a space for female amateurs as well. And as an educator, she was notable for this buoyant, sunshiny style that was, supposedly encouraging for these practitioners, encouraging to undertake these complex projects and that they could be competent with a jigsaw or whatever equipment they needed. So you asked about what the classroom would look like. I suppose the answer is that her practice was diverse and she was also creating, textual instructions that could be undertaken for projects at home, as well as offering art classes to educators in the space of the corporate headquarters of the American Crayon Company, which were in Los Angeles and in Rockefeller Center in New York. So it had different applications.
Would you be able to expand further on the influences of commercialism on the child art movement and how it may have negatively or not negatively affected its development in the United States?
Sure, absolutely. So I love these questions because I'm getting a chance to sort of expand on some of the things we brought up before. So the American Crayon Company was the second largest crayon company in America at the time, second only to Binney and Smith, the makers of Crayola. And they had a periodical which was called Everyday Art, which was a sort of promotional journal aimed at school teachers. And you see, beginning in the 1930s, that Zweybrück is brought in as this outside expert. She writes columns frequently, and then eventually she is made editor of the journal. So she really has an important impact on popularizing Cižek's ideas and bringing them into the mainstream, into these suburban developments, into these suburban ranch homes, into the everyday homes of post-war America. Now, one thing that is controversial is this commercial aspect. She is using Cižek's ideas to literally sell crayons. I mean, she was given an encomium by Hans Ankwitz Klehoven, the longtime librarian of the Museum for Art and Industry in Vienna, and he looks to the way that she applies these ideas in a commercial sense. So, in a nutshell, she developed various commercial sets, prepackaged commercial sets that were used to make Cižek's ideas accessible. Let's take a practical example. So, one thing that she published on at length and specialized in was stenciling. Stenciling was a medium that she believed that was particularly suited to children because of the inherent formal simplifications in the medium. It was also an aesthetic that overlapped with folk art and was favored by folk artists as well. So in her work for the American Crayon Company, for instance, she creates prepackaged stencil sets that were accompanied with paint and made arguably these ideas of children's creativity accessible for parents and educators. Now, there are many examples of new product lines that she launches, paints that were particularly suited to painting on textiles. As I mentioned before, I am particularly fascinated by her very close relationship with Ray and Charles Eames, whom she met through other Austrian emigres. And I don't think that necessarily because her application was commercial, do we have to look her as lesser than a pedagogue whose applications were purely educational. She is deeply committed to the ideals of mid-century modernism and really wanted to bring, the ideas of Ray and Charles Eames to a widespread American audience and introduce American audiences to their films, for instance.
Further to that point, I think it kind of relates. In the introduction, you discuss an instance where you were talking to your son, and it kind of gave you some insights on this. Would you be able to share this interaction with your son, Otto? And could you also explain how, if at all, having kids of your own has changed your own perspectives or approaches to this topic?
I mean, so it's a great, paradox when you're writing about children's culture, right? Adult scholars are making prescriptive claims on behalf of children. What is it that children actually think? Cižek thought it was all well and good for children to be uninfluenced, to be shielded from the influence of adult art and drawings and museums. But what do the children actually think themselves? That's an entirely other issue. Do we have the right to shield them? So, one topic that is relevant today is children in the marketplace, children and digital culture. One thing that I noticed that my son Otto introduced me to was this phenomenon of YouTube drawing tutorials that had a very strong commercial aspect. So at the time, our son was studying at a school, and he was introduced to, through the curriculum, these YouTube drawing tutorials that were called the Art Hub for Kids. And he pleaded with me that I should buy him this particular brand of markers. It was obviously the same brand of markers that was sold by the makers of the videos, right? You needed to buy their own branded markers to execute these drawings, which were step by step outlines of, various shapes, animals, figures, people that left very little room for children's own creativity. So, of course, as I said in the book, my inner Cižekian self shuddered to see how children were given these step-by-step prescriptive drawings. So it's a major point of debate in bringing children into the marketplace. Is it right for the makers of these art supplies to market directly to children? It, of course, relates to a longer standing debates on children's culture and the marketplace, children's television, children's programming. It's no surprise that children are marketed to directly through sort of flashy, over the top commercials that project children's culture in ways that everyday life is portrayed as more exciting than it actually is through the purchase of these new products, be it children's cereal or toys, or in this case, art supplies for children.
Perhaps I'm jumping too far ahead, but I really find the connection with the current state of things in the digital era for kids compared to when these ideas were first being created by Cižek and spread throughout the United States. Because on one hand, he would be happy to see how many kids are eagerly creating art of their own and are interested in shows about how to draw and so on. But at the same time, the fact that they are being exposed in these ways kind of goes against his idea of kids being exposed to too many books or museums or exhibitions early, kind of hindering their own purity of self-expression. I think that the counter argument that I have heard today for that would more so be that kids are exposed to so much such an eclectic range of ideas and artworks at a young age that in their own pieces it would reflect a more just eclectic and diverse existence. What do you think his thoughts on child art in the digital age would be?
That's such a great question. And I mean, I address it more or less through my own voice in the afterword to the book, heavily inflected by Cižek's own ideas. So, in a nutshell, I don't think he would approve of this digital culture for children. You know, children today are exposed to a crazy amount of screen time, which I do not believe, and many pedagogues and commentators do not believe is at all helpful or useful. Children watch as much as 9.5 hours of screen time on a dizzying array of different devices: computers, laptops, iPads, iPhone. And of course, it's the attendant mentality that accompanies these devices, the iPad, right? It's pop-up ads, it's notifications that are constantly chipping away at our ability to concentrate. And I do not think that this is healthy for children's creativity or ability to relate as human beings. I actually read Jonathan Haidt's latest book after I finished the afterword, but I'm going to fold some of his ideas into it anyways because I love them, right? In a nutshell, I do not think that Cižek would love or even like or approve of the digitalization of children's creativity. You know, there is a widespread culture of do-it-yourself projects for children on Instagram and other form of digital social media. There are these drawing tutorials, as I mentioned before, step by step how to draw on YouTube when, you know, children can help themselves. Yeah, so there's this new genre of sort of creative parenting manuals that are loosely informed by this Cižekian tradition of the invisible teacher. That is to say, the teacher whose teaching is limited to indirect guiding and influence and doesn't teach in the traditional way. Now, there are a variety of approaches outlined in these creative teaching art method books, many of which use upcycled materials. Um, but one thing that is important to consider in these books is hierarchies of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. So in reading these creative parenting manuals, if you want to call them that, one thing that I was struck by is that if you want to raise your children creatively in this way, you really have to dedicate yourself to this in an almost full-time way. And as good as these projects might sound, you know, this is a form of creativity that is sharply, you know, delimited by the socioeconomic status, the access to leisure time of the parents. So I really don't think this is a solution at all. Added to the fact that the emphasis on upcycling, right, in many of these parenting manuals doesn't really disguise the fact that a household still has to have a huge amount of excess consumer goods that are able to be, you know, recycled or upcycled into craft projects. So I think it's sort of a fiction to say that this emphasis on upcycling in children's creative projects today is sort of outside the values of the marketplace and somehow alternative do-it-yourself ethos. It's repackaging this sort of consumerism in a different way.
It really does feel like the most American angle for the movement to develop over here. But
Absolutely.
to kind of track back now and go to your final case study of Viktor Lowenfeld, could you kind of highlight his importance to this story and what his career was like?
Sure, absolutely. So, in terms of the case studies in the book, Cižek, Zweybrück, Lowenfeld, Cižek is definitely the most well known. Zweybrück, increasingly more so. And Lowenfeld is curious because he's very well known today in the field of American art education. He is a giant in the field of American art education. He founded a pioneering program in art education at Penn State University, where he spent the bulk of his career after emigration. But he's curiously unknown in the field of fin de siècle Vienna, in Austrian cultural history and Austrian artistic history. And I think this part is a very important story to be told. So again, Lowenfeld is sort of the founder of modern American art education, the field of art therapy. There are named lectures still held in his honor today, but he has all but been erased from the canon of Viennese cultural history, Viennese art history. And the reasons why are complicated, but largely related to his status as a liberal, Zionist leaning Jew who was forced to immigrate after the Anschluss. And in this post war rediscovery of the glittering art and culture of the turn of the century, it is my argument in the book that a figure like Lowenfeld, with these affiliations to Zionism, with these affiliations to socialism and this very liberal progressive agenda, that he was simply perceived as too liberal, too dangerous, too edgy to be reclaimed and folded into this emerging canon of Viennese modernism. So in this regard, the work in the book overlaps with the work of some of my colleagues, like the amazing Laura Morowitz, Francis Tanzer, and others who talk about the historiographical issues that went into the founding of this canon of Viennese modernism. So in a nutshell, it was an artistic movement that was partially sustained by and powered by the influence of Viennese Jews, Viennese artists, Viennese critics, but they were selectively written in or written out into this canon of Viennese modernism, which of course then was used to paper over Austria's turbulent Nazi past. So in a nutshell, it's very interesting that he has all but been written out of the history of Viennese modernism, but remains this towering giant in the field of American art education.
I think that this notion of, I guess you could call it historical revisionism in a way of the Nazi era using these artists is important. Would you be able to expand on this a little bit, why it happened and how it happened?
So, in a nutshell, there was a revival of interest in Viennese modernism by municipal cultural leaders in the post-war period. There were a number of exhibitions, publications that threw attention on the glittering art and culture of Vienna 1900. Klimt, Schiller Kokoschka were made into the household names that they are today. And in a large part, not exclusively, this was used to sort of deflect attention away from the exigencies of 1933, 1938, 1945. Now, it is highly ironic that Jews also played a large part in defining this artistic culture of secessionist Vienna, yet, of course, were written out from that. So the very artistic milieu that they helped to co-define themselves, as my colleague Alana Shafira has written on so eloquently, that would later exclude them, to sort of erase the tarnished history after 1938, how many Austrians, of course, enthusiastically welcomed Hitler after the Anschluss and before, of course.
So Franz Cižek is an interesting figure in the story, also not just because of the profound impact of his teachings and how they developed, but also the fact that he did have a connection to the National Socialists when they took over. And how do you go about analyzing his impacts and his teachings with the knowledge that he was also a part of this much more negative, sinister movement in history?
Yeah, this is an issue that I really wrestled with very carefully, because this is something of great, importance, and you want to get it really right. It's a matter of nuance. So the connections of Franz Cižek to National Socialism is something that has sort of been side-skirted from previous secondary publications, and I bring it into the book for many reasons. but also because it may very well have factored into the decisions of municipal cultural leaders in the post-war period to basically can his book project. Cižek had this over-the-top, exuberant writing style and did produce the manuscript for Yale University Press. He died in 1946. It was up to his longtime teaching assistant to bring the book project to fruition and have it published. But there were some, reviews, outside reviews of the manuscript, and some of them point to problematic racial passages. And while it is difficult to tell with certainty, it very well may have been possible that the presence of these vague references to race and hereditary qualities may have been one reason why these municipal cultural leaders decided to quietly can the book project, or perhaps to sort of shove the manuscript itself into sort of an obscure desk drawer and sort of let it be forgotten. So in the critical 1985 Cižek retrospective at the Wien Museum, in the catalog, one of the curators did mention a few pieces of information about his connection to National Socialism. Cižek did have a provisional membership card in the League of National Socialist Teachers. Before that, he was a member of the right-wing conservative anti-Semitic Neuer Werkbund Wien. He was also a member of the Fatherland Front. So Cižek really is this political chameleon who goes from being feted under the monarchy to getting imperial orders, to definitely being a favorite of social democratic reformers, Otto Glocke, and then this political transition to Austrofascism and I guess you could say follower under National Socialism. So in a nutshell, to what degree did Cižek come into line? It's difficult to say with certainty. So here are some of the things we have to consider. Cižek was a very old man when all of this was going down after the Anschluss, and especially during the war. He died in very poor health and was nearly blind, and was basically blind when he died in 1946. So I did read a dissertation where the author was sort of maintaining there are a number of primary source texts with National Socialist sympathies penned by Cižek's close followers, and essentially that we cannot have Cižek be responsible for this, precisely because he was too senile to know what was going on around him. While that might be tempting to succumb to that narrative, I ultimately do think that Cižek has to be held accountable for his decisions, for his choice to come into line. So he was not a party member, that didn't occur. But definitely he wanted his colleagues to think that he held these racial ideas enough to allow his courses to continue. He was responsible for appointing a party member, the art educator, the drawing teacher, someone who had been heavily involved in the drawing reforms of interwar Vienna. His name was Josef Ettel. He has Josef Ettel named as so-called politischer Berater for his youth art classes. And he names him to this position in an official letter to the Reichsstatthalter in 1943, and basically says that I'm naming him as my political advisor so that my classes can be brought into line artistically and educationally with the ideals of National Socialism. It's unequivocal in his language. He was responsible for this. There was an important primary source text written by Ettel in 1943 on the 40th anniversary of the youth art classes, in which he effectively claims Cižek as National Socialist. He revises the famous discovery of children's art to inject racial ideals into it. So for instance, according to Ettel, the Vienna secessionists were excited about children's art. They discovered it. They were enthusiastic about it precisely because it represented a homegrown, Germanic source of artistic purity against the grain of foreign models. It's very clearly there in this text. In this text, Etos cites Hitler, using Hitler's ideas on creativity in early childhood to effectively frame Cižek as a National Socialist. Now, this text was not written by Cižek because it refers to him definitively in the third person. But there are other manuscripts that Cižek dictated to some of his other assistants, like Adohaj Micecek, which do contain vague references to race, hereditary qualities, and the influence of the earth in distilling children's artistic creativity. So it's very thorny, it's very complicated. He was not a party member, but he did come into line, and he ultimately has to be, his legacy should be held accountable for this, I think.
To take a step back now, looking at Franz Cižek, Emmy Zweybrück, and Viktor Lowenfeld from above, how would you describe the through line between these three individuals and the story and ideas you're trying to express in the book? How do they relate and how do they differ?
That's a great question. There's definitely a strong sort of narrative arc throughout the book. And one of these connecting themes is the idea that these ideas are notoriously difficult to implement, right? You ask, what did this classroom look like? Well, Cižek's classroom was a mecca for progressive art educators. It was notable for its jewel-like colors, these large murals of children's art that were hung on the wall in these bright tones. There was music played, children were allowed to move freely, and they were non-compulsory. They were offered on Saturdays, no grades, and you didn't have to show up. So one theme that runs through all three art educators is the challenges of implementing this ideal of the Cižekian teacher. How do you teach without teaching or imparting knowledge in the traditional sense? In terms of the three case studies, it was Lowenfeld who was far less adamant that children be shielded from the influence of adult art. He thought it was inevitable that they would be affected by the world around them. They were also all committed to modernist art and design in different ways. And we didn't get a chance to talk about Lowenfeld so much, but one interesting thing about Lowenfeld, he is this refugee, this exiled Viennese Jew. He is deeply committed to children's creativity as a sort of bandage for the rampant consumerism and materialism that was gripping post-war America, and thought that creativity could sort of recenter post-war America on the democratic values that would heal the social and racial tensions of the present. Now, ironically, in part, this rampant consumerism of post-war America, I don't want to say was created by, it wasn't, but it was linked to other exiled Viennese Jews, such as the architect and designer Viktor, whom some of my colleagues have written on with the dubious title of the founder of the shopping mall. Now, he, in fact, was also a socialist and wanted to create connections and communal facilities that would bring the sort of scattered suburban residents together in new and invigorating ways. Didn't intend for the shopping mall to become what it did. But it's interesting that Lowenfeld saw children's creativity as a sort of alternative to the rampant consumerism of the present. I mentioned Zweybrück's strong commitment to mid-century modernism and to bringing mid-century modernism into the faces of everyday American consumers through her role in editing everyday art. Well, this commitment to modern and contemporary design was something that also extended to Lowenfeld, not a very publicized part of his writing. But essentially, he believed that while progressive educators were excited about new methods of teaching children art, that they tended to be in conflict with the aesthetic values in their everyday life. So while they may have harbored progressive ideas in terms of education, they were content to live in colonial revival homes or teach in a college with some sort of historicist revival style, or even drive a car that was styled with remarkably retrograde features. So he also challenged everyday Americans to bring their aesthetic surroundings in harmony with their educational ideals.
Fantastic. Was there anything else that you wanted to discuss that we haven't really had a chance to do yet?
I mean, I totally leave it to you. This is such a great podcast.
Thank you. Well, then, I guess the fun question I was really looking forward to asking was if you had the chance to meet one of these three individuals and ask them a single question, who would you most be interested in meeting? And do you have an idea of what you would ask?
This is such a great question. I think you've totally stumped me. I I mean, you know what? I think I'm going to just go with my gut. There's so many questions I'd love to ask all of them. They were all sort of workhorses and so committed and so passionate about what they did. Because I have been wrestling with this issue of Cižek and National Socialism so much and rereading these archival documents, I would really love to get inside of his head and ask him what he actually thought. Was he committed to any of these ideas? That would be my question.
Yeah, that would be quite interesting. I wasn't sure. My guess was that you would choose Cižek or Zweybrück. But and then my final question, which is kind of two parts, would be what do you most hope that readers take away from your book? And also, if they were to be inspired to do future research based on the book, what paths or what lanes do you think could most benefit from that further research?
Well, this might be a different way of answering the question, but I think one of the strengths of the book is that it's not a one-trick pony, that there are so many facets to it. So it's a story of the transmission of progressive ideas of children's creativity, of teaching children art from Secessionist Vienna to post-war America. But this is a story that is necessarily linked to other stories. It's this emphasis on emigre culture, the Viennese modernists in exile. It's also a story of these very exciting, I find them exciting, understudied linkages between Viennese secessionism and mid-century American modernism. So I would hope that that would inspire for further research, not just on the influence of the sort of canonical Vienna secessionists on the turn of the century America, but on these deep connections between the mid-century period. The Ray and Charles Eames papers at the Library of Congress is a wealth of fascinating perspectives on this professional and personal relationship between Ray and Charles Eames and Emmy Zweybrück. So they came into contact through their mutual acquaintance and friend, the architect Richard Neutra, and really became close friends. And one of my favorite pieces from the archive, which is voluminous, is this hand-doodled cartoon, a newspaper clipping from Vienna, unlabeled, that talk about an exhibition of modernist art and architecture in the Vienna Secession in 1955, in which the films of Ray and Charles Eames were to be shown. And it's very characteristically Zweybrück. She doodles a heart around this clipping that's sort of vaguely referencing Pennsylvania German folk art, and with her handwritten annotation. So Ray and Charles Eames, Vienna will also love them as well, sort of translating loosely. So I hope that the readers will take from the book what is useful to them, whether a new perspective on emigre culture, the influence of these exiled experts in post-war America, which definitely intersects with the amazing work of my colleague Paul Lerner, and perhaps new ways of looking at their children's own creativity and the digital age of the present. Maybe a reminder to put that iPad or phone or whatever away.
I think that was a perfect way to end it. I want to say thank you again for taking the time to be on the podcast. From what I've read of the book so far, it's extremely good at not just informing about the history, but also helping the reader to relate to the subject matter themselves and how it may affect their own lives. Would you be able to tell readers when they can expect the book to come out and where they could find it?
Absolutely. So the book will be coming out with Bloomsbury Academic sometime in mid-2025.
Great. Thank you so much for being on, Megan.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember to check the episode description to find more from our guest. Follow us on social media or turn on notifications to get alerts for future episodes. The Botstiber Institute for Austrian-American Studies promotes an understanding of the historic relationship between the United States and Austria, including the lands of the former Habsburg Empire, by awarding grants and fellowships, organizing lectures and conferences, and publishing the Journal of Austrian-American History. We engage with a broader public audience through digital programming, including videos, podcasts, and blog posts. Auf Wiedersehen, and see you next time.